Hello my friends, I want to welcome you to our channel, which will help you fall asleep easily and with benefit. Share with us where you're watching from right now and what time it is for you. And while you're writing, I'll begin. Year 1955. The planet was in the midst of a standoff between superpowers. Yet Southeast Asia was engulfed in an even more fierce conflict. This conflict, the Vietnam War. What began as a geopolitical game of great powers turned into a deadly struggle for the future of the Vietnamese nation. It would split the country in two, fill the jungles with blood, fracture American society, and ultimately claim the lives of over 3 million people. The unthinkable happened. The United States was defeated. But how did it happen? How did a local incident escalate into a bloody confrontation lasting over 20 years? To understand, one must go back to the very origins. In 2879 BC, long before the devastating battles, Vietnam was a land of lush forests and mighty rivers. This land lay at the eastern tip of the Indo-Chinese peninsula. It bordered the high mountains of China to the north, Laos and Cambodia to the west, and was washed by the South China Sea to the east. According to Vietnamese legends, the country was ruled by the great sovereign Ong Vuong. Under him, the Vietnamese mastered wet rice cultivation and began producing bronze tools. Ong Vuong and his successors ruled the people for a long time, laying the foundations of Vietnamese civilization. However, this period of peace could not last forever. By 57 BC, the Chinese commander Tru Dai invaded Vietnam and overthrew the last king of the Hung dynasty. Tru Dai united the scattered tribes into a single state and founded the Co Loa fortress as the capital. Being a Chinese general, he promoted trade between China and Vietnam, expanding borders. But his rule was not eternal either. A storm was brewing, and soon it broke. By 111 BC, the sisters Trong Trak and Trong Ni raised a rebellion. Like a flame, it quickly spread across all of Vietnam. These women led an army that recaptured the country from the Chinese. However, China was not prepared to accept the loss. To regain control, additional troops and generals were sent. The Vietnamese fought, but the sisters tragically perished, and Vietnam once again fell under Chinese dominion. This domination lasted almost 1,000 years, until 938 AD. During this period, Han Dynasty rulers imposed Chinese culture, customs, laws, and religious teachings like Buddhism and Taoism on the Vietnamese. My Son in central Vietnam remains one of the most significant Hindu temple complexes. However, the Vietnamese resisted. Rebellions flared up across the country. Buildings were burned. Concerned, the Chinese sent General Ma Yuan to suppress the revolts. But the Vietnamese could not be broken. They found a hero, the brave military commander Ngo Quyen. He led his people in the Battle of the Bac Dang River, where he defeated the Chinese Han Dynasty. This victory brought Vietnam independence and began the Ngo Dynasty. But independence did not solve all problems. The Ngo Dynasty was ultimately overthrown by another Vietnamese leader, Dinh Bo Linh, in 968 AD. Dinh Bo Linh was a man of a particular mindset, striving to unify Vietnam. He introduced an imperial system of governance and moved the capital to Ho Lu. He also promoted the spread of Buddhism. However, barely consolidated, Dinh Bo Linh was assassinated in 979 AD. He was succeeded by the La dynasty led by La Tai Tu. He had his own goal, to unify Vietnam with a common culture. Therefore, upon ascending the throne, he moved the capital to Thanh Long. Under this dynasty, Vietnam prospered. For the first time in history, the Vietnamese adopted Buddhism as the state religion and expanded their territories. Gradually, this dynasty helped form borders close to the outlines of modern Vietnam. And just as it seemed peace was settling in Vietnam, internal conflicts began, and in 1225 AD, the Tran family overthrew the La dynasty. The Tran dynasty was powerful. It proved its right to rule by enduring severe trials. They managed to strengthen national unity and repel 3 Mongol invasions. But that was not enough. By 1400 AD, they were overthrown by the Ho dynasty. Ho Chi Minh probably thought his luck would be better and attempted reforms. However, these plans were not destined to be fulfilled. The Vietnamese resisted his rule, and though he handled internal threats, external ones proved insurmountable. In the end, he was overthrown by the Chinese Ming dynasty just 7 years after coming to power. The Chinese returned, but they didn't even have time to unpack. Vietnamese resistance forces fiercely opposed them, and by 1427 AD had expelled them again. This struggle was led by a new national hero, Le Loi, Leking Go Quyen. He founded the Le dynasty after Vietnam gained independence. However, by 1527 Vietnam was again plunged into chaos. The Mac family staged a coup and overthrew the Le dynasty. But they did not last long either. From the moment he came to power, Mac Dang Dung faced opposition from supporters of the Le dynasty. He was overthrown by these forces, and Vietnam plunged into complete chaos. A wave of revolt swept the country, and many local leaders emerged. Nguyen lords in the south and Trinh lords in the north. Vietnam was torn apart and in deep crisis. It was this crisis that opened the door to problems of unimaginable scale. Foreign invaders from Europe. It should be noted that these newcomers did not initially arrive with firearms. First, they came as missionaries with Bibles and trade offers. But this was the era of European imperialism, and European powers sought to establish colonies worldwide. It was during this period that France turned its gaze to Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam. Although the French arrived as traders and missionaries, they found the Nguyen and Trinh lords mired in infighting. Vietnam was in chaos. The French saw this as a perfect opportunity and took advantage of it. They quickly established the French Catholic Church and began converting people to Christianity. The Vietnamese lords did not stop feuding, and in the metropole, France craved new colonies. Exploiting the division, the French decided it was a chance to take control. In 1858, an event occurred that forever changed Vietnam. With all the protests happening, President Lyndon Johnson was under great pressure. No one wanted the war, and they had suffered losses thanks to the Tet Offensive. He struggled to justify the U.S. presence in Vietnam. What's worse, members of his own party began to leave him, leaving him alone to justify the war. However, this would not be his problem forever. By 1969, President Johnson left office and left the pressure of the war to the new president. President Richard Nixon, please repeat after me. I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear. I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear. When President Richard Nixon took office, pressure to end the war only intensified. During his election campaign, he had promised the American people peace with honor. But now the American people didn't even care about honor. They just wanted the war to end, and the United States to withdraw troops. President Nixon took office with a million questions to be answered. How would he handle these ticking time bombs? Richard Nixon was a man with a huge problem. Here he was, the 37th President of the United States, waging a war that had consumed the U.S. for nearly a decade. What's worse, no one wanted it anymore. But it was he who was tasked with ending it. Richard Nixon had campaigned under the slogan of peace with honor, and he desperately wanted that honor. The United States couldn't just run away from Vietnam with its tail between its legs as if defeated. They had to leave with honor, and so Nixon came up with a plan. This plan was known as Vietnamization. You see, while Johnson had Americanized the war, Nixon hoped to withdraw American forces and Vietnamize it. His plan was exactly that, to shift the war from American shoulders to the shoulders of the South Vietnamese. They would train and equip the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, so they could defend the South from Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam. Thus, American military could be slowly withdrawn without admitting defeat. So, in November 1969, Nixon addressed U.S. citizens. He appealed to those who were not on the streets protesting but still believed in the war effort, but were now tired of seeing American soldiers die. He called them the silent majority, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans. I ask for your support. In that speech, he said this strategy would be the path to peace with honor. They would slowly bring U.S. forces home and still support the South Vietnamese government. This was the beginning of the withdrawal of American soldiers. By June 1969, he had withdrawn over 25,000 soldiers, and within 2 years he withdrew over 350,000 soldiers from Vietnam, with the goal being complete withdrawal by 1973. However, there was a huge problem. As the United States left, the South Vietnamese army was left to fight North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. And, as you probably guessed, seeing the reduction in American presence, this was only fuel to the fire burning in General Giap and Ho Chi Minh. They doubled their attacks and continued to attack cities and villages in South Vietnam. Using their signature tactics, they hit and retreated, ambushed soldiers, and used their tunnels. Although Nixon's plan looked great on paper, it wasn't, mostly because the ARVN, despite all the training and equipment received from the U.S., were still not ready for war. The Viet Cong intensified their attacks, and South Vietnamese soldiers performed poorly. They did not have numerical advantage. And what's worse, with the U.S. departure, they felt abandoned and had low morale. They also lacked firepower or solid coordination. Add the evident corruption in the army, and it was clear they were struggling seriously. But Nixon had promised the American public, so he continued to withdraw troops anyway. But despite this, people continued to protest. While some were happy and relieved the troops were finally coming home, others felt he should take all the troops out at once, and he was only delaying the inevitable. So many of them continued to protest the slow withdrawal, holding signs saying "Bring them all home." Now, as Nixon handled this pressure, he also handled pressure from South Vietnam. President Nguyen Van Thieu, the president of South Vietnam, was not happy with the U.S. withdrawal. He said his army was still poorly prepared and that without American support, the scales would tip in favor of the North, and they would be vulnerable. Despite the protests and his pleas, President Nixon stuck to his Vietnamization strategy. He withdrew forces in batches and promised President Thieu that the United States would support them with both military and financial aid. But it wasn't enough. The South Vietnamese army was left to fight dangerous battles that they seemed to be losing. One of these were Viet Cong attacks in the Mekong Delta. President Nixon, however, continued to support South Vietnam in the hope of keeping it afloat. He sent planes, artillery, military supplies, and tanks, but it never seemed to be enough. President Nixon, on the other hand, told the public that his strategy was successful. In a public address, he said South Vietnam was becoming more capable each day and that their army had been strengthened. But in reality, everything was falling apart. Nevertheless, there were still some American soldiers left in South Vietnam, and before leaving they needed to address the elephant in the room. The Viet Cong continued to attack South Vietnam, which they were mostly able to do thanks to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Although North Vietnam did not officially attack South Vietnam, they had used this trail from the very beginning to send supplies to the Viet Cong. By 1969, it became obvious that to effectively reduce the power of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, they had to close this trail. Once President Nixon saw this, he decided they had to strike. And in March 1969, they began Operation Menu. The goal of the operation was to bomb places where they suspected the Ho Chi Minh Trail was, and cut the Viet Cong supply lines. However, this time they would bomb not only North Vietnam, they would bomb parts of the trail that ran through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. Laos and Cambodia had been very neutral during the war, but there were several Viet Cong sanctuaries in Cambodia. To do this meant President Nixon and U.S. forces were taking the war beyond Vietnam. And therein lay the catch. They could not let the American public or Congress know about it. President Nixon was selling the idea that they were leaving Vietnam. If people found out, he feared it would cause a huge backlash, mostly because Cambodia and Laos had been neutral from the start. He also argued it was the only way to stop Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam from gaining an advantage. In his view, it was necessary if they ever wanted to win the war. They began bombing, a massive bombing operation. It was staggering. They dropped over 400,000 tons of bombs on Laos and over 2 million tons on Cambodia. These bombings destroyed several villages. Thousands of civilians in these places were killed, and some were left homeless. What's worse, the trail continued to function, and the Viet Cong rebuilt it as soon as it was destroyed. But that wasn't the worst part. In America, news of the bombings leaked and caused outrage among the people. Everyone was furious. From students to activists and even members of Congress, they felt betrayed. Nixon's worst nightmare had come true. Feeling betrayed, crowds again took to the streets in protest. Universities, which had been at the forefront of protests, saw crowds again. One such university where crowds began to gather was Kent State University in Ohio. Students at the university began a peaceful protest against President Nixon's betrayal on May 1st. They were disappointed and angry, and the protests grew in intensity constantly. By May 3rd, Ohio Governor James Rhodes spoke out against the protests, and Kent Mayor Leroy Satcham declared a state of emergency. He also called in the National Guard to maintain order. But this did not stop the students from coming out. It angered them. The next day, May 4th, hundreds of students gathered at Kent State University to protest again. At the governor's direction, the Ohio National Guard was also there, armed and ready. The protest heated up, and officers eventually used tear gas to disperse the students. But it didn't help. Refusing to leave, students threw stones at the guardsmen, and chaos began. What happened next is one of the most tragic events to occur in an anti-war protest in modern American history. By noon, the National Guard opened fire on the students. For 13 painful seconds, they fired on unarmed students, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. Walter Cronkite was an American journalist who had supported the war in the past. He believed in the domino theory and thought the United States was winning the war. He was trusted by people, and sometimes some even called him the most trusted man in America. However, hearing about the Tet Offensive and the attack on the embassy, Cronkite wanted to see for himself. He went to Vietnam to see what was happening. He realized the war was bloodier than reported and that the U.S. might not win. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. In a report made on February 22, 1968, Walter Cronkite told Americans the war would end in a stalemate. His report changed everything. If Cronkite, a man who had been so sure, now doubted the war, all hope was lost. He was not the only one. Other news stations like CBS, ABC, and NBC also began showing the bloody realities of the war. Other small groups still roamed the city. The Viet Cong is reported to be in full control of the militant Buddhist headquarters. Less than a mile from the city center, they showed American soldiers fighting in the streets, trying to win a guerrilla war. They showed several of these soldiers killed and several others wounded, with the wounded being taken away by helicopters. They showed several civilians homeless and attacked. They also destroyed villages. For the first time, the American people saw real images of the war, and they were horrified. They took to the streets and began protesting this war they thought was senseless. Those who had supported now felt the war was not worth all the lives and resources being lost. There were protests in major cities, on streets, and on college campuses against the war, with several of them attacking President Johnson for continuing the war so long. Remember that President Johnson came in with guns blazing, confident that the best thing to do was to keep fighting Vietnam. However, even seeing the Tet Offensive, they knew they were very far from winning the war. His problems were compounded as U.S. citizens now took to the streets, saying they had lost faith in both President Johnson and the war itself. With each day, the pressure intensified. Protests on the streets grew. The media spoke negatively of him, and soon members of his own party also joined in. They asked Johnson if he really had firm control of the situation and if the war could be won. As the presidential election approached, President Johnson's popularity plummeted. By March 1968, just 2 months after the Tet Offensive, his approval rating hit rock bottom. He was under pressure to get out of Vietnam from both U.S. citizens and members of his own party, the Democratic Party. By March 31st, President Lyndon B. Johnson laid down his arms and addressed the nation. This address was a huge shock because he said he would not seek re-election in the upcoming U.S. election. Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president. Moreover, he indicated that the Vietnam War had cost him both U.S. finances and his chance at re-election. Despite this announcement, protests intensified. Despite losing the military war, General Giap and Ho Chi Minh had won the psychological war. The Tet Offensive broke the will of the American public to fight. President Johnson also resigned. But even with this great victory, they still could not celebrate. There were still a few questions that needed to be answered. What would happen now? Would U.S. forces remain in Vietnam? The Tet Offensive caused chaos in the United States. There was an explosion of anger and multiple calls for change. Like North and South Vietnam, the United States was now divided because of the Vietnam War, to stay or to withdraw troops. By the last months of 1968, more people leaned towards the choice of withdrawing troops. In cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, millions of Americans, including war veterans, held signs demanding an end to the war. Lieutenant Pam died while I got the medal. So I said, John, die while I get the medal. These protests spread beyond the United States and onto the international stage. As protests continued, their purpose improved. It wasn't just about the war. Beneath the surface, there was something more. To continue this very demanding war, the United States had to draft more young men to join the army. Initially, people joined voluntarily, united by the purpose. But now, with more media coverage of the war, it became obvious they were losing. The question arose whether America was even right to be there in the first place. With the loss of morale, people were tired of seeing their loved ones taken to war on another continent, mostly because they no longer believed in the purpose of the war. And though the government promised them progress, it certainly didn't seem like it was happening or would happen. Nevertheless, the U.S. government still drafted young men, some barely out of high school, to join the army and fight in this war. What's worse, the draft service had an eligible pool of 27 million men, and they drafted over 2 million men. However, the draftees were mostly working class and minorities who did not receive deferments through education or connections. When the population observed this trend, they saw the injustice of these young men, who had little or no choice, being forced to fight in a war whose purpose they did not support. This realization led to a movement known as draft resistance. On college campuses, students came out to protest the draft. Several students at universities like the University of California, Kent State University, Columbia University, and Berkeley protested against the draft. In San Francisco and Newark, citizens burned draft cards and declared they would not serve to show they did not support. But it wasn't just students protesting. Influential figures also began to protest. One of these figures was Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1967. Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech at the Riverside Church in Newark. In the speech, he condemned the war and asked the U.S. to stop fighting in Vietnam and instead focus on issues affecting Americans at home, issues like poverty and racism. He accused the American government of being the cause of violence in the world. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place. when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. King's speech was received as very controversial and caused a wave across the country. But he was not the only one. One of the greatest fighters of all time, Muhammad Ali, also spoke out about the war. Muhammad Ali was silent until he was drafted to serve in the American Army. Initially, Ali scored low on the qualification test, but the American Army, desperately in need of soldiers, lowered the standards for entry. So with this adjustment, Ali was deemed fit. However, Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the army. He claimed he was a Muslim and the war was against the teachings of the Quran. He also said he never had any quarrel with the Viet Cong, and they never called him a racial slur. Don't make me go shoot my brother. Some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America and shoot them for what? They never call me nigger. This statement added to the cries of those who felt this war was unjust. However, the United States government disagreed. He was not only stripped of his heavyweight belts and boxing license in every state of the United States, Muhammad Ali was stripped of his passport. But it didn't stop there. The undisputed champion was arrested and convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to prison for refusing to serve. Although his sentence was later overturned in 1971 due to a technical error by the Justice Department, his stance gave support to anti-war sentiments. In 1968, the Democratic Party was holding its national convention in Chicago. However, thousands of leftist, counterculture, and anti-war groups, including people who felt President Johnson was not listening, stood outside Grant Park and Michigan Avenue, demanding an end to the war. This peaceful demonstration eventually led to a clash with police. The media showed videos of batons, injured and bloody protesters, and the use of tear gas. These images shocked families watching at home, and even more people began calling for an end to the war. These sentiments spilled beyond the United States and spread across Europe, Asia, and Australia. In Britain, people protested on the streets, calling for an end to the war. Oxford University students came out, holding signs and calling for an end to the offensive in Vietnam. The same was happening in France. People came out to protest the war, and these protests eventually led to strikes in May 1968 that brought the country to the verge of a standstill. In Japan, protesters stood outside American military bases and official buildings, demanding an end to the war in Vietnam. They were sometimes booby-trapped, and when not, they were set with Viet Cong traps. This made it almost impossible to find Viet Cong fighters. The bitter truth was that General Westmoreland severely underestimated the Viet Cong and their preparedness. He did not know as much as he thought. You see, thanks to all the bombing campaigns, the strategy of the North had changed drastically. Guerrilla fighters not only went deeper into the jungles but also moved underground. Underground, they had an extensive network of tunnels that could stretch for miles. You never knew where one began and where it ended or where it led. In these tunnels, there were rooms that served as living quarters, storage, weapons caches, and even hospitals. With the help of these tunnels, they could remain undetectable. Guerrilla fighters would emerge and stage ambushes on the U.S. Army and then disappear. Those who did not fall into an ambush or were not sabotaged fought the heat, diseases, and traps left for them in the jungles. Viet Cong soldiers also knew how to blend in with village residents and then disappear into the jungles after an attack. If the U.S. Army managed to clear a village by day, the Viet Cong would return at night. Despite the victories they had, the Viet Cong had a way to avoid them. The United States sent troops, but this was not a conventional war. At some point, it began to seem like they were fighting smoke. They had only one option left if they wanted to get to the Viet Cong: go into the tunnels. To wage this underground war, the U.S. could not use a typical soldier. They needed special kinds of soldiers. These soldiers were small but brave people who descended underground and crawled through these tunnels. To go in, they had to be small and slim. These soldiers had to crawl in the dark because light would give away their position. These soldiers were called tunnel rats. Being a tunnel rat was one of the most dangerous jobs in the Vietnam War. Several of them entered tunnels and never came out alive. It was because of poisonous creatures like snakes and scorpions. A rat could bump into the roof of a tunnel and release a swarm of scorpions on itself. A tunnel rat had to be on alert all the time, because every corner could bring an ambush, and he could die. It was a terrifying task. While U.S. Army soldiers risked their lives in tunnels, you might wonder what the South Vietnamese Army was doing at this time. Well, not very much. You see, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, also known as ARVN, was poorly trained and often poorly led. Plus, even the new government was corrupt at its core. So, while the U.S. Army was busy with major operations, the South Vietnamese Army had one job: to maintain control in rural villages and the countryside. This was because these areas were among the first to support the Viet Cong and needed to be kept under control. However, the ARVN failed at this job. They were ineffective, and the U.S. Army had to do most of the work to prevent the Viet Cong from winning, as it was clear South Vietnam could not win this war on its own. Interestingly, General Giap and North Vietnam weren't even trying to win the war militarily. Instead, they saw it as a war of attrition. It was just as they saw the battle with France. All they needed to do was prolong the war as long as possible until the United States grew tired and began to feel the war was too costly to continue fighting. Even though President Lyndon B. Johnson Americanized the war, he quickly learned that defeating North Vietnam would not be as easy as he thought. They bombed from the air and failed. They sent ground troops and still struggled. What were they to do next? As President Johnson was asking himself this question, something was about to happen that would shake the U.S. Army and South Vietnam to their core. It was January 31st, 1968. It was the date of the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and everyone in Vietnam was busy celebrating Tet at this time. A ceasefire was agreed upon for both sides to enjoy peace while the celebrations continued. However, Tet 1968 would not be like others. Something happened that would change the history of the Vietnam War. Although it seemed Ho Chi Minh and General Giap were coping, they also knew they needed a way to destabilize the South Vietnamese government and the United States. General Vo Nguyen Giap then came up with a brilliant idea. That idea was the Tet Offensive. You see, General Giap knew they could not defeat the American army in a direct fight. However, they had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu with a large-scale offensive. His idea was that the same thing done to the United States would also break their will and allow them to see how costly the war was. Moreover, a large-scale offensive would destroy the South Vietnamese government. He planned to launch a massive coordinated surprise attack on over 100 cities in South Vietnam, including United States military bases. It was one of the most daring military attacks of the 20th century. However, since the attack was to be a surprise, they had to take advantage of the moment when the U.S. Army least expected it. And what better time than the period of peace provided for celebrating Tet? In the last quarter of 1967, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong began preparing for the attack. They secretly moved weapons and ammunition into cities like Saigon, Da Nang, and Hue. They hid these weapons in their underground tunnels and bunkers, away from the eyes of American and South Vietnamese armies. Over 85,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers moved into these cities and took up positions, awaiting the Tet celebration. Then on the night of January 30th, 1968, they struck. The attacks were coordinated and happened all across South Vietnam simultaneously. In Saigon, the Viet Cong attacked the American embassy. They broke through the outer walls and penetrated the compound, while several other fighters on the streets of Saigon engaged the U.S. Army. Although it may seem the attack in Saigon was the most intense due to the assault on the U.S. embassy, it was not. The most intense fighting happened in Hue, where Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces took control of the city. They attacked over 100 cities, taking control of most of them. The US and South Vietnamese armies were caught by surprise. It was shocking to see such a large-scale offensive when they were supposed to be celebrating a quiet holiday. Nevertheless, the US Army responded as quickly as possible. Most American soldiers were stationed far from the attacked cities, and it was difficult to move them all at once. Despite the chaos, the American Army fought in Saigon to protect the embassy and guard key government buildings. The war was so intense that U.S. Marines had to be sent to Hue for one of the most intense battles of the offensive. Using Marines, they tried to take control of the city and went from house to house, fighting guerrilla fighters. By the end of that month, Hue was destroyed. Several civilians were killed, and several others were left homeless as their homes were turned to ruins in the midst of war. The war was brutal, and guerrilla fighters again used their signature tactics. U.S. forces saw them destroying buildings and then disappearing back into the jungles, or blending in with people. They did not know who was a guerrilla fighter or which building they were in. They had to retake the city block by block, as every building could be a trap or a potential ambush site. General Giap, on the other hand, being an incredibly wise military leader, knew that even if they might not win the military war, they would win the psychological war. He believed that if he could strike so many targets at once, it would cause a ripple effect around the world. It would show outsiders and even the American people at home that the U.S. Army was not winning the war. The attack would be unexpected, and they would gain some territory before the U.S. Army could come up with a counterattack, further increasing the cost of the war. They would also prove to the South Vietnamese people that their government had failed, because nowhere in South Vietnam was safe, not even in Saigon where the U.S. Embassy was located. However, by the end of the attack, the Tet Offensive became a military failure. The Viet Cong and North Vietnam suffered huge losses and lost over 45,000 fighters. What's worse, the South Vietnamese government did not collapse. Surprisingly, they together with U.S. forces were able to retake most of the territory the Viet Cong had attacked. Nevertheless, General Giap was right. They won the psychological war. Due to the large-scale nature of the Tet Offensive, it caused ripples across the globe and even across the United States. Despite what was happening, the people in America were being told that the U.S. was winning the war and that all their efforts were paying off. However, when news arrived that Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces not only attacked cities across South Vietnam but even managed to attack Saigon, it became clear it was all a lie. The fighters not only attacked Saigon, they also managed to penetrate the United States Embassy. Hearing this, the American public began to doubt everything they were being told about the war, mostly because it suddenly became clear they were not winning. In the past, the media relied on military briefings to cover the war. However, with these attacks and with public calls, the media began to look closely at Vietnam. And when they did, they had horrifying pictures, photos that showed destroyed cities, body bags, and wounded soldiers. The Tet Offensive became a turning point for the people of America. One journalist was able to further shake their opinion, and he was none other than the famous Walter Cronkite. However, the situation spiraled out of control. On November 1, 1963, General Duong Van Minh led a group of officers and staged the coup. They captured Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. By the next day, they were executed. Within 18 hours, the uprising was over, and a military junta led by General Duong Van Minh seized power. They named Diem's vice president as prime minister of a transitional regime, which was recognized by the United States. President Kennedy felt terrible, period. In my opinion, why it was poorly composed. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a round table where McNamara and Taylor could present their views. He had no idea Diem would be killed. However, that didn't matter much. Barely 20 days later, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy, unfortunately, would meet the same fate. After President Kennedy's assassination, a new man took office who took charge of U.S. interests in the Vietnam situation. And again, this man was President Lyndon B. Johnson. Unlike President Kennedy, President Johnson did not ponder his strategy. He fully believed in the domino effect and wanted to secure South Vietnam at any cost. He believed the United States should not sit by and watch Vietnam fall. So he became deeply involved in the conflict. He hadn't sent troops yet, but the situation was heating up and everything was about to change. On August 2, 1964, U.S. Navy ships, including the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy, were conducting reconnaissance missions in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The only problem with this was that the Gulf of Tonkin was located in the northeastern part of North Vietnam. It bordered major North Vietnamese provinces like Hai Phong, Tay Binh, and Quang Ninh. Secondly, these missions conducted by U.S. Navy ships involved secret attacks on North Vietnamese installations and radar stations. Ho Chi Minh and other North Vietnamese leaders saw this as an attack and decided to confront the ships. On August 2nd, they attacked the USS Maddox. Both sides ended up exchanging fire. Somehow the Maddox avoided serious damage, but the threat to peace had already been broken. 2 days later, reports came in that another American vessel had been attacked. Later people would argue whether this second attack actually occurred. In fact, in 2002, much later, intelligence reports would show there was no attack at all. However, at the time, this was more than enough for a very impatient President Lyndon Johnson to begin acting. Within days, he addressed the nation and declared that U.S. forces had been directly attacked by North Vietnam in international waters. It is my duty to the American people to report renewed hostile actions against U.S. ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin. He claimed the attack was unprovoked, despite their initial reasons for being there in the first place. He also said this attack was a direct threat to the United States and their interests in Vietnam. He called for public support to fully enter the war. It was an easy request. Most Americans at the time were already worried about the spread of communism and easily rallied around their president. With this approval, President Johnson felt emboldened and he acted quickly. He took the matter to the American Congress, and by August 7th, Congress gave him what he wanted. They resolved that President Lyndon Johnson had the authority to take all necessary measures to stop any armed attacks against U.S. forces and any aggression that followed. This agreement was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Simply put, it was basically a blank check that would allow Johnson to fully engage in the war. President Johnson had always been eager to suppress communist movements in Vietnam, and now that he had carte blanche, he wasted no time. He introduced troops and weapons into South Vietnam to help protect the government. However, the Viet Cong were not afraid. They attacked several American military installations in South Vietnam. On February 7, 1965, they attacked U.S. troops in Pleiku and killed 8 Americans. Several were wounded. For President Johnson and his advisors, that was enough. It was the last straw. By March, the United States began an operation that would set North Vietnam on fire and forever change the history of the war. Infuriated, President Johnson took decisive measures to fight the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. He devised a massive campaign that he thought would solve the problem once and for all. This campaign was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It was a massive bombing campaign that lasted over 3 years. From March 1965 to November 1968, Johnson and U.S. forces constantly bombed North Vietnam. On the surface, Johnson's goal was simple. It was to cut off the support the Viet Cong received from North Vietnam. They would do this by destroying supply routes, infrastructure, and military bases. However, beneath the surface there was another reason for such consistent bombing. It was also psychological warfare. You see, President Johnson and U.S. forces hoped that such a large amount of constant and destructive devastation would force Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leaders to surrender and agree to negotiate. He hoped the Vietnamese people would see the scale of destruction and break, turning to their government with the choice of the logical option, the negotiating table. This was not ordinary bombing. Daily, bombers flew from military bases in South Vietnam and neighboring countries like Thailand. They dropped tons of bombs on North Vietnam. In the first few months, they bombed warehouses, bridges, military bases, and supply lines in North Vietnam. Later, they also began bombing transport networks. One of these networks was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was used to supply support and weapons to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. However, President Johnson and U.S. forces were in for a serious surprise. You see, Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leaders were not frightened by the bombings. Ho Chi Minh soon realized what was happening and decided he would not just sit back and let the U.S. destroy North Vietnam. Again, he turned to his allies, China and the Soviet Union, with their help. They prepared for the bombings. They were able to assemble radar systems, anti-aircraft missiles, and anti-aircraft guns to build an air defense network. With this network, they were able to counter the U.S. air bombardments. They shot down several aircraft and captured several pilots. Strangely, the bombings only strengthened their resolve for a free and unified Vietnam. Under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, people rebuilt destroyed bridges and roads. They worked day and night to also restore supply lines. Despite constant bombings, they worked to restore the Ho Chi Minh Trail and continued to send support to the Viet Cong in the south. It was almost as if the destruction did not affect their activity. The truth was that Ho Chi Minh and his generals soon realized that U.S. forces were not going to stop their bombings anytime soon. To cope, they began building underground tunnels and started moving more and more of their operations underground. Operation Rolling Thunder soon became a rolling disaster. President Johnson hoped it would be quick and easy, but he was shocked to see it drag on. Soon the American people began seeing pictures of bombed-out cities and villages in North Vietnam. The operation also killed over 100,000 Vietnamese, including soldiers and civilians. The U.S. Army also lost over 1,000 lives, and over 500 of their planes were shot down and destroyed beyond repair. The American people became less and less pleased with this war. Soon they took to the streets of America in protest. Left with no choice, President Johnson had to end the relentless bombings in November 1968. However, if you think that meant he was going to give up, you're in for a surprise. For President Johnson, it was not the end. It only meant he needed to rethink his strategy. He would not be able to defeat Vietnam from the sky. He would have to go to the ground to fight them in cities, at their bases, and in the jungles. And who entrusted us with the terror, repression, and killings that would follow? President Johnson then announced he was sending more infantry to Vietnam and increasing the U.S. presence in Vietnam to nearly 500,000 soldiers. His plan was to directly fight the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army in South Vietnam. They hoped they could save South Vietnam from falling to communism. Ground forces would be deployed to areas like the Mekong Delta, Saigon, the Central Highlands, and the border of South Vietnam with the North. This operation would be led by a man who had stayed in South Vietnam for some time and had an understanding of the war. His name was General William Westmoreland. General Westmoreland was the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. He had stayed in Vietnam for some time and had a plan on how to defeat their enemies. His plan involved the U.S. Army conducting large-scale search and destroy missions, along with their support. So the first thing he did was create military bases in places like Cam Ranh, Khe Sanh, and Da Nang. It was from these bases that they began operations on enemy territory. On the surface, The plan was simple. Search and destroy missions involved dropping soldiers with helicopters into jungles where, as presumed, Viet Cong fighters were hiding. The plan was to simply engage the enemy, destroy their bases, and then quickly withdraw. However, it was more complicated than it seemed. The terrain was difficult. There were jungles and mountains. What's worse, there were also rice paddies. They were filled with water and impeded movement. They also informed the fighters about the movements and plans of the South Vietnamese army. This support made it difficult for Diem to eradicate the rebels. They had to act on suspicion, since they could not tell who was a civilian and who was a Viet Cong fighter. They sometimes acted decisively in paranoia, burning villages, imprisoning, killing, and punishing innocents as well. This only made Diem more repressive. But this war was not just about who controlled Vietnam. Outside Vietnam, the world was deeply immersed in the middle of the Cold War, and Vietnam was a key battlefield because of its division. Ho Chi Minh and his leaders in the North saw communism as their way to fight Western imperialism. He believed that if Vietnam were united under a communist government, it would encourage other states fighting for their independence and tell the West that their years of imperialism were over. But forces outside Vietnam had a different idea. One of these forces was the United States. For the United States, the stakes were much higher than the local politics of the Vietnamese people. The stakes were about democracy in Southeast Asia. You see, after World War II, the Soviet Union grew stronger, and the spread of communism was increasing. In 1949, mainland China fell to communism, and as if it wasn't enough, the United States also received a recent blow at the time. In July 1953, the bloody Korean War ended in a stalemate with no winner, and border revision remained the same. If this were allowed to happen in Vietnam, what would happen to all of Southeast Asia? One man in the United States seriously pondered this question. This man was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, long before the rise of the Viet Cong. President Eisenhower was worried about what was happening in Vietnam. It was his worry that gave birth to the domino theory. He spoke about the domino theory for the first time in 1954 after the end of the First Indochina War. President Eisenhower warned the world that if one country in Southeast Asia became a communist state, others would follow, like a row of falling dominoes, one after another. He argued that if Vietnam fell to communism, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and eventually Indonesia and India would also fall to communism. If we leave Vietnam, the communists will control Vietnam. Very soon Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya will fall. President Eisenhower was not going to sit idly by and watch. He and the United States government wanted to contain the spread of communism worldwide. To stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, he had to ensure that Vietnam did not become a red state. To do this, Vietnam became the front line of America's Cold War. However, President Eisenhower knew it would not be an easy battle. He saw the fall of Dien Bien Phu and France's defeat if the French with all their military might could not stop the Viet Minh. How could the South Vietnamese government stop them? Worse, the government was already crumbling under Viet Cong pressure. But this was not the only battle. The United States had recently emerged from the Korean War. It was an expensive and brutal war that changed little, so he was very cautious about entering another war so soon. He decided to devise a plan. He planned that instead of sending infantry to the South Vietnamese government, he would support them with financial and military aid. Fortunately, President Ngo Dinh Diem was very anti-communist. He was perfect to help hold the front. He not only offered aid, but, like Russia and China, he also sent military advisors to South Vietnam to train troops. Eisenhower spent millions of dollars trying to strengthen South Vietnam's military forces. However, the more he and the American government tried, the more they realized there was an even bigger problem they had missed. This problem was none other than their man on the front line, President Ngo Dinh Diem himself. In South Vietnam, Diem was not a very popular figure. He lacked support from rural villages and was harsh. Even the elites were slowly beginning to turn against him. President Eisenhower began to doubt whether President Diem could unite the country at all. He wasn't even popular in the South. How on earth was he going to conquer the North? Eisenhower needed a strong South Vietnamese authority if he was going to resist the influence of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong. But Diem's government alienated over half the population, and this only allowed the Viet Cong to become stronger and more popular. By the end of the 1950s, President Eisenhower and his government became restless. His term was coming to an end, and the Viet Cong was only getting stronger. What would he do? Continue to only support South Vietnam and hope it didn't collapse? Or would he and the United States have to take matters into their own hands to stop Vietnam from falling like the first domino? Well, interestingly, Eisenhower never got to make the decision before he left office in 1961. He was succeeded by President John F. Kennedy. When President Kennedy came to power, he already had some problems waiting for him. One of these problems was the crisis in Vietnam, and it was not going to die down anytime soon. Adhering to his predecessor's original plan, Kennedy increased support for Diem and the South Vietnamese government. He sent fighter jets and other armaments, and increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam from just over 600 to nearly 18,000, like Eisenhower. He also wanted to strengthen Diem's regime and increase their economic support. But like a house on a shaky foundation, their efforts came to nothing due to Diem himself and his lack of popular support. President Kennedy and President Diem had to devise a new plan to help achieve their goal. This plan was known as the Strategic Hamlet Program. The goal of the program was to secure rural areas and win the hearts of villagers. They would build fortified villages to house locals and push out Viet Cong fighters, so they could not mingle with the villagers. President Kennedy liked the idea and supported it. But you guessed it, the plan also failed, and its progress was very slow. They failed to win popular support from the people. You already know why. By the end of 1962, John Kennedy had already begun to doubt whether the U.S. should intervene in the troubles brewing in South Vietnam. It was obvious that Diem's government was harsh and authoritarian and not loved by the people. By 1963, Diem persecuted even more Buddhists and people he suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. This action led to widespread protests against Diem. Soon, plans emerged to overthrow President Ngo Dinh Diem and stage a coup. John F. Kennedy received intelligence about this coup sometime in August, long before it happened. He spoke with his advisors, and they were divided on the issue. Some of them thought President Diem was the best option for fighting communism, while others thought he was authoritarian and it was undermining all their efforts. John F. Kennedy found himself leaning towards the guys who thought Diem was wasting their efforts with his style of governance. Now things were about to get very interesting and tense. Now you might be curious to know that the coup in South Vietnam was staged not by the Viet Cong, but by Diem's own military officers who were tired of Diem's government. They were still anti-communist, but they didn't like his leadership style. These officers were people like General Duong Van Minh, who was the coup leader, and General Tran Van Don, who was then the army chief. When Kennedy learned of this, he decided they had nothing to lose. If they could get rid of Diem and still have anti-communist leadership, it would be a win-win. He called Diem and asked him to sign a document agreeing to resign as president of South Vietnam. If he resigned, they would offer him American protection. Well, Diem did everything to hold on to power. He was not going to give it up so easily now, so he refused. Kennedy, using CIA assistance, then offered silent support to the coup organizers. He also encouraged people to believe in Marxist-Leninist thought. Ho Chi Minh's government spoke of itself as the true defender of Vietnamese independence. After all, it was they who fought the French colonial powers. Ho Chi Minh was convinced that unifying Vietnam would require a battle, and because of this, he built an army. This army was known as the People's Army of Vietnam. It was a strong and disciplined force, trained by both Chinese and Soviet advisors. Seeing North Vietnam leaning towards communist ideals, the Soviets also began offering support to Ho Chi Minh. However, in South Vietnam, the story was completely different. The two sides were as different as black and white. In the South, Ngo Dinh Diem was elected prime minister, and he created the Republic of Vietnam. He was oriented towards the West, and for that reason was a staunch opponent of communist ideas. He also restored the Catholic Church in South Vietnam. With the restoration of the Catholic Church, he tried to force everyone to adopt Christianity and eradicate other religions, including Buddhism, which had been brought by the Chinese. As you can imagine, Buddhists in South Vietnam did not like him very much and did not support his leadership. But Ngo Dinh Diem did not care about that. He believed he had the support of the West, including the United States. He had a goal. His goal was to build a capitalist state in South Vietnam. This goal would never fully succeed. It was because he was not a popular leader, and political opponents protested against him. Diem suppressed these protests, and soon his government became a government of nepotism and corruption. Communists in South Vietnam protested against his government, and he tried to crush them. Anyone who tried to disagree with him was eliminated. Soon the people of South Vietnam began to crumble. As Diem continued his aggressive rule, people grumbled that he was just another colonial figure. What was the difference between a Vietnamese who didn't care about them and a French colonial ruler? Soon they began to form groups to oppose him. These groups were far from Diem and located in the countryside. They also mainly consisted of Viet Minh fighters who had fought against the French. As Ngo Dinh Diem struggled to suppress his opposition, another pressure was building outside South Vietnam. Unbeknownst to him, South Vietnam was about to explode. According to the Geneva Accords, both sides were to hold nationwide elections in 1956 so that Vietnam would be united under one government. Ho Chi Minh and his leaders in North Vietnam were confident they were more popular and that they would win in free and fair elections. They had the reputation of freedom fighters. Moreover, they were a popular government in the North thanks to their land reforms and nationalism. Once they won, Ho Chi Minh believed his dream would come true, to see Vietnam united under a communist state. And Ngo Dinh Diem, on the other hand, was not happy with the idea of elections. He suspected Ho Chi Minh and his leaders would win, and then Vietnam would be taken over by communists. So, as he did whenever he feared opposition, he suppressed the ideas. Diem had the support of the United States, and with their support, he stubbornly refused to hold the elections. He claimed there was no political freedom in the North and that any votes held in the North would be rigged because they were controlled by communism. All of Ho Chi Minh's peaceful attempts to reunite Vietnam were rejected by Diem. This was the beginning of the explosion that would engulf the entire state of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and the rest in the North were outraged by Diem's refusal to hold elections, because it was part of their agreement in the Geneva Accords. Worse still, Ho Chi Minh saw Diem and his leaders as puppets of the West and colonialists. He believed Diem was being used to stop the true independence of the Vietnamese people, and he was determined to reunite Vietnam at any cost, even if it involved another war. Remember that in South Vietnam, some old Viet Minh fighters remained in the countryside and had already begun creating resistance. Ho Chi Minh, aware of this group, gave the green light for them to begin taking up arms against the South. These old fighters were located in rural areas where people felt the pain caused by Diem's cruel government. Most of these people had also benefited from Viet Minh reforms during the First Indochina War and were tired of Diem's government. Soon resistance was formed. In December 1960, a group known as the National Liberation Front NLF, or Viet Cong, was formed in Tay Ninh province. On the surface, it was just a group of forces, including former Viet Minh members, oppressed communists, angry locals, and anyone who simply wanted to get rid of Diem. However, beneath the surface, it was a group actively sponsored by Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam, and they had one goal: the overthrow of the South Vietnamese government. You see, Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap were working again. This time they wanted to unify Vietnam by any means. Ho Chi Minh knew they could not openly confront Diem's government. If they dared to invade the South, it would immediately provoke U.S. intervention. The only way to overthrow Diem was to use internal means. It had to look as if the people of South Vietnam were opposing the government, even if it was all directed from Hanoi. General Giap would again rely on the tactics that helped them defeat the French: guerrilla warfare. From North Vietnam, he would control and direct this tactic to the NLF or Viet Cong in the rural side of South Vietnam. The group was divided into two parts. The NLF was the political wing of the group, and the Viet Cong was the military wing, although it looked as if the group was simply expressing the will of the southern people. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap would pull the strings from behind the scenes to destabilize Diem. The Viet Cong was created quietly in the shadow of the rural South. War veterans who remained after the Geneva Accords led the attacks. They were experienced in guerrilla warfare and knew the terrain. The best part was that Diem was not very popular among the people, so the Viet Cong also had the support of people in the countryside. They set up their camps in these rural areas, mostly deep in the jungles where they were sure Diem's army would never reach. However, to have a full impact, they needed weapons, supplies, and training for those who were not war veterans but wanted to join the cause. This help had to come from North Vietnam. But there was a problem. North Vietnam could not help openly. They had to help secretly, in a way that would not alert Diem and his forces or provoke the United States. They had to make sure everything looked like the revolution was internal. So Ho Chi Minh had to devise a plan. This plan was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail was a network of roads linking North Vietnam to Laos and Cambodia. Before finding its way into the jungles of South Vietnam, the trail was ingenious. North Vietnamese workers and their soldiers spent years secretly building the trail. And when it was ready, it was used to supply weapons to the Viet Cong so they could be strong enough for the revolution. Fully armed, the Viet Cong's strategy was the same old strategy that helped them win the First Indochina War. They would not attack Diem's army head-on. Instead, they would ambush military personnel and destroy infrastructure, including buildings, trains, railways, and bridges. They also found ways to kill leaders and officials who supported and were loyal to President Diem. They created complete chaos in the hope of making the Vietnamese government weak and showing it could not maintain peace. Their tactics were very destructive. Even though Diem's forces had better weapons, they were mostly trained for conventional warfare. They did not fully understand Viet Minh strategies and did not know how to fight an enemy who just disappeared after an attack. Worse, when they tried to follow the Viet Cong into the jungles or wherever they hid, they were ambushed, entered by painful traps, or killed by enemies who knew the terrain much better than they did. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong was no longer a small rebel group. They were a full-fledged guerrilla army and began more daring and coordinated attacks. That put strong pressure on President Diem. But if you think Diem sat idly by all this time watching them overthrow him, you couldn't be more wrong. Ngo Dinh Diem, hearing about the rebels in the countryside, immediately understood it was communists trying to overthrow his regime. In his typical style, his government imprisoned and killed anyone who was a suspected communist and conducted raids in the countryside. His soldiers raided villages where they thought communists were hiding, destroyed homes, and killed suspects. Yet, instead of suppressing his opposition, his determined raids only fanned the flames. If you wonder why, it's because Diem and his forces did not know that besides their military training, the Viet Cong had another secret. This secret was also a main strength for them and worked to further ruin Diem's reputation and make it difficult for him. You see, the Viet Cong knew how to blend in with the local population and mix with villagers. They stayed in the south, so they knew most villages. Worse, Diem and his government were seen as corrupt, harsh, and repressive. The Viet Cong promised these villagers that if they won the struggle, they would carry out land reforms like in the north and fight the rich elites controlling the south. For this reason, it was easy for them to get support from the villagers. Therefore, he engaged in propaganda campaigns. He spoke out against colonialism and urged people to join the struggle for an independent Vietnam. The Viet Minh used posters and even held rallies to win people to their side. Also, whenever the Viet Minh managed to take control of an area during the war, they took land from rich landowners and gave it to poor peasants. These actions significantly increased their popularity among Vietnamese peasants, who had suffered under French and Japanese rule. By the late 1940s, most people fully supported the Viet Minh. However, popular support was not enough. Ho Chi Minh knew they needed allies and external support, so he turned to Indochina's neighbor, China. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was formed. The following year, China recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. China established a communist government and was more favorable to the communist-leaning Viet Minh than to French troops. By April 1950, Ho Chi Minh asked China for military assistance, and they responded. They sent weapons and logistical support. They used the mountains of northern Vietnam and Lao Cai and Lang Son to send this weaponry and support. They used the Lao Cai route to send military supplies, while Lang Son was convenient for moving troops. Noticing the lack of military knowledge among Viet Minh troops, they also sent military advisors. These advisors formed the Chinese Military Advisory Group. By September of that year, China sent thousands of rifles, artillery, and cannons to Vietnam. This made them stronger against French forces. China also protected the north of Vietnam. But because China supported the Viet Minh, it wasn't just the French who panicked. The United States also began to worry. When the war first started, the Americans had slight sympathy for the Vietnamese efforts for independence. However, by 1950, the Cold War had already begun, and they saw Vietnam receiving support from the communist side. They feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would fall too. So they finally decided to heed French requests for support. President Harry Truman, then President of the United States, approved a sum of $15 million to help France defeat the Viet Minh. They also continued to provide more support as the war dragged on. However, now that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh Army had Chinese help, their troops grew to almost 100,000 soldiers. That same year, they were able to launch a major attack in the north. They targeted French posts along the Chinese border. Using more intense guerrilla tactics, they were able to force the French to retreat. This victory spread joy among the Viet Minh and Vietnamese. It also strengthened Chinese support for them. But this was only the beginning. Things were already starting to change. The Viet Minh began to reclaim several parts of Vietnam, including Ho Chi Minh, located west of Hanoi. The following year, France began an attack on Ho Chi Minh. Very frustrated with fighting an enemy they could not see or anticipate, they hoped they could lure Ho Chi Minh and his forces into a one-on-one battle. But they could not have been more wrong. Vo Nguyen Giap led Viet Minh forces to break through French lines and instead encircle French forces. The real turnaround, they refused to engage in direct contact, and France eventually chickened out and retreated. Once again, the Viet Minh proved it could win a war of attrition. The war continued to drag on, and although both sides suffered, no one could claim victory. However, just 2 years later, in 1954, something happened that changed the course of the First Indochina War. The French made a fatal mistake. The mistake began in 1953 with a man named General Henry Navarre. General Henry was the head of the French High Command. In late 1953, Navarre came up with the idea of creating a French military outpost at Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was a remote valley near the Vietnamese border with Laos. His grand plan was that if they commanded there, they could cut off supply lines from Vietnam to Laos. It would also be an excellent place to launch an attack against the Viet Minh. So they began creating this base. General Navarre ensured this base was fortified with airstrips, and that they could receive supplies by air. He was convinced that the French army had more weapons, and with their support, they could repel any Viet Minh attack. This would help them control the region. He could not have been more wrong. At the head of the Viet Minh forces was General Vo Nguyen Giap, a man General Navarre should never have underestimated. General Giap noticed the location of the French base at Dien Bien Phu, and instead of seeing a threat, saw a huge opportunity. He immediately gathered about 40,000 soldiers, and they began to encircle the base and cut off all overland supply routes into the valley. The French base was under siege, but General Giap knew that was not enough. Using impressive logistics, he and the Viet Minh forces managed to move heavy artillery across the rugged terrain of the valley. They dragged this artillery through the jungles and placed it on the mountains surrounding the base. General Giap knew that if they could position themselves on the high ground dominating the valley, they would surround the French base both on the ground and from above. This would give them the advantage, as they could bombard French troops from above and below. By March 13, 1954, General Giap and his troops were ready. They began the attack on Dien Bien Phu, and this marked the beginning of a fierce battle. The French were surrounded by endless artillery fire from above and relentless attacks from the ground. The siege lasted 56 days, with the Viet Minh attacking day and night. They used a combination of conventional warfare and guerrilla tactics. French forces thought they could get air support, but even that failed. General Giap and his men specifically targeted their airstrips and transport planes. They were trapped. French soldiers were dying, and they could not receive supplies. As casualties mounted, French troops began to lose morale. However, despite their relentless attack, General Giap still had one last card up his sleeve. In May, he led the Viet Minh in launching a massive final assault on French positions in the valley. The French were overwhelmed, and they surrendered. Over 9,000 French soldiers surrendered to the Viet Minh. This victory sent shockwaves around the world. The Viet Minh had won, and Dien Bien Phu fell. It was the final blow to the French army. The war had become too costly to maintain, and they had no choice but to leave Vietnam. It was their departure that led to the Geneva Conference on April 26, 1954. The purpose of this conference was to resolve issues from both the Korean War and the First Indochina War. Several countries participated: France and Vietnam, represented by Ho Chi Minh, and the Viet Minh, Laos, Cambodia, and even the United States and their arch-rival, the Soviet Union. Negotiations lasted over 70 days as they argued about Vietnam's future. Finally, on July 21st, they were able to sign the Geneva Accords. Vietnam was free. It was agreed that no military personnel from foreign states should be allowed into Vietnam again, unless requested by the local government. It was a huge victory for Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. But their battle was far from over. It was only just beginning, because although Vietnam was granted independence, some hidden seeds of discord were sown in Geneva. These seeds would only lead to a larger war that would never leave Vietnam the same. You see, although the Geneva Accords granted Vietnam independence, they granted independence to a divided Vietnam. Initially, the Viet Minh consisted of all Vietnamese. Despite their beliefs, the only thing that united them was the desire for independence. During the Geneva Conference, the thread holding this unity broke, and Vietnam was divided into two zones along the 17th parallel. These two zones were North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was to be ruled by the Viet Minh, who were committed communists, while South Vietnam, which was more Western, was to be ruled by the former Emperor Bao Dai. Both sides were given 300 days to withdraw their troops and weapons and move to their respective sides of the line. Vietnam was divided. However, Ho Chi Minh did not like this idea. His dream was to see a unified and independent Vietnam. He and his supporters advocated for this at the conference. In the end, it was agreed that nationwide elections would be held in July 1956 to reunify Vietnam under one government. It was a huge victory for Ho Chi Minh because it meant a democratic process would be used to determine Vietnam's future. However, this celebration had a bitter side that from the very beginning only foretold doom. You see, many countries at the conference agreed to sign and abide by these agreements, including even China and France. However, the United States did not. They insisted they were not bound by these agreements, and their reasons were that they shared the sentiments of the South Vietnamese leaders. Under Bao Dai, these South Vietnamese leaders did not want to participate in elections that would bring a communist government to power. The United States, as expected, was also not happy with this idea. Nevertheless, the agreement was signed, and both groups returned to their sides of Vietnam. North Vietnam had major cities like Hanoi, while South Vietnam had cities like Saigon. In the north, Ho Chi Minh continued to proclaim himself leader of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He firmly believed in his dream of a unified and independent Vietnam under communism. After what happened in Versailles, he was convinced that true freedom would never come to Vietnam from the West. He continued his land reforms, giving land to poor peasants and creating a system of collective farming through propaganda. In 1858, a man named Napoleon III led a French invasion of Vietnam. His goal was to return Indochina to the fold of the French Empire. However, the Vietnamese disagreed. They launched an attack on Da Nang to fight for their country. The Vietnamese gathered forces and fought the French. This struggle lasted almost 4 years, but the Vietnamese were poorly prepared and exhausted by years of continuous conflict. By 1862, France achieved its first victory. They captured the city of Saigon and forced Emperor Duc to sign a treaty. Under this treaty, all southern provinces of Vietnam passed to the French. It was known as the Treaty of Saigon. This marked the beginning of French domination in Vietnam. However, France had its eyes not only on Vietnam. Britain, another European superpower, controlled India and Burma. France needed to strengthen its position in South Asia and also create a buffer zone between its possessions and British colonies. Therefore, they also sought to capture Vietnam's neighbors, Laos and Cambodia. Napoleon III was also extremely interested in the resources of these regions. He wanted to control Cambodia's rubber, Laos's minerals, and Vietnam's rice. Therefore, he was not satisfied with just southern Vietnam. He sent French troops to conquer Tonkin in northern Vietnam and Annam in the central part. They also subjugated Cambodia and Laos. All three territories were unified into French Indochina in 1887. While the French celebrated success, discontent was growing among the Vietnamese people. Like the Chinese, France also tried to replace Vietnamese culture with its own. First, they made Saigon the capital of Indochina, where all the French elites settled. Then they began building European-style buildings and filling the market with luxury goods. But that was not the only problem. Vietnamese peasants were forced to grow rice and toil every day, only to see their harvest go to French trade. Despite the hard labor, they still paid high taxes and lost their lands. Soon, people stopped merely grumbling about the cruelty of the French government and began planning resistance. Rebellions flared up across the country, but each time, French authorities quickly suppressed these attempts until one man appeared. He was the only one who could bring about real change. This man was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was born during French rule in Vietnam. From a young age, he saw the suffering of his people under the French. These thoughts haunted him. When he studied at the National Academy in Hue, he opposed the French in Indochina and was expelled. But this did not quench his thirst for knowledge and his dream of an independent Vietnam, free from the colonial yoke. After his expulsion, Ho Chi Minh traveled extensively around the world, visiting the United States and even living in Paris. By the end of World War I, Ho Chi Minh held great hope for the Versailles Peace Conference. He saw it as a chance to convey the suffering of his people. He was particularly inspired by the possibility of sending a petition to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. This was because the American president had previously advocated for the right of nations to self-determination. When Ho Chi Minh was allowed to speak, he passionately demanded rights for the Vietnamese. He called for freedom of the press, the release of prisoners held by the French, and independence for Vietnam. However, Ho Chi Minh faced disappointment. He was ignored not only by France, but also by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson at that time did not want to spoil relations with France. It was at this moment that Ho Chi Minh realized that other means would have to be sought to liberate his people, however radical. From then on, his views became more radical. Realizing that help from the West would not come, he began studying communist ideologies and, returning to his homeland, was determined. Upon returning, he found his people oppressed even more than when he left. This prompted him to start a nationalist movement to unite the Vietnamese against the French government. He founded a party known as the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which later became the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party consisted of Ho Chi Minh's like-minded individuals. It included workers, peasants, and other intellectuals, all striving to liberate Vietnam from French colonial rule. With this party, Ho Chi Minh called for independence. He urged the Vietnamese to take up arms, as he saw this as the only path to liberation. Although he tried, he still could not fully confront the French forces. However, by 1940, the world outside Vietnam was engulfed in flames. World War II began. France focused its main attention on Germany. But before the Vietnamese could take heart, Japan noticed an opportunity. Taking advantage of France's distraction, they invaded Vietnam and captured it. However, although they established their regime, control largely remained in French hands. But Ho Chi Minh did not sit idly by. He was not going to watch another country oppress his people. He needed to devise a plan. Although he had the ICP, and party members were determined, they were few and could not defeat the French on their own. He needed popular support. So, the next year, 1931, he did something remarkable. He created a coalition of communists from his party and Vietnamese nationalists. This coalition became known as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh had one goal: to unite every Vietnamese, regardless of belief, to fight against foreign rule. It should be remembered that all this happened while France was fighting World War II. They had no time for events in Vietnam. The Viet Minh, seeing this distraction, began the struggle to win people to their side and resist against the Japanese and French. Ho Chi Minh led this group to begin their struggle using guerrilla warfare tactics. These were small, fast, and well-coordinated strikes against Japanese forces. He also had generals like Vo Nguyen Giap, who joined him in leading these guerrilla actions against the Japanese. These attacks became known as the August Revolution of 1945. By September, something unthinkable happened. The World War was ending, and Japan was no longer strong enough to hold Vietnam. Noticing their weakness, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh intensified their efforts and eventually took control of Hanoi. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a huge crowd in Ba Dinh Square and proclaimed Vietnam's independence. He paraphrased the United States Declaration of Independence, stating that all men are created equal, and called for the right of the Vietnamese to freedom and self-determination. The people cheered Ho Chi Minh. He became a national hero. However, this joy did not last long, as France had other plans. When World War II ended, they returned to take control of their valuable colony. only to find Vietnam had declared itself free from colonial rule. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh refused to relinquish this independence and stood in the way of French forces. However, by December 1946, France ran out of patience and decided to retake the colony by force. They entered Haiphong with tens of thousands of soldiers and military equipment, turning the confrontation into a full-scale war. This attack in Haiphong claimed the lives of over 2,000 Vietnamese. The French army grew to 190,000 soldiers. These soldiers were not only French forces. They also included units of their colonial troops from Senegal and North Africa. After the attack on Haiphong, using modern weapons and artillery, including air support, they were also able to capture major Vietnamese cities like Hanoi and Saigon. Their goal was to completely destroy the Viet Minh on the world stage. Tensions arose over colonial control. However, the West, including the United States, noticed that Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam were receiving support from communist states like China and the Soviet Union. Then they decided it was better for Vietnam to remain under French colonialism than to be given to the Red Bandits. The Viet Minh was significantly outnumbered. Ho Chi Minh and his troops had only about 50,000 people in total. However, these people were not all soldiers. Most were ordinary villagers and farmers who did not know how to fight very well. The only thing they knew was that they would not give Vietnam back to French forces. One of Ho Chi Minh's generals, Vo Nguyen Giap, was a man who, like Ho Chi Minh, was also well educated. He traveled across Europe and studied several warfare tactics. Seeing that they were outnumbered and not very experienced, Vo Nguyen Giap knew they could not defeat the French in a conventional war. So he led Viet Minh groups in attacks using guerrilla warfare. They used hit-and-run tactics against French forces, constantly keeping them confused and on edge. His goal was to wear them down before even considering direct confrontation. Viet Minh troops hid in bushes and ambushed French patrols. They sabotaged supply lines. And as soon as French troops thought they could breathe a sigh of relief, the Viet Minh attacked again. These strikes were always strong, fast, and devastating for French forces. They were not prepared for such a war. The French severely underestimated the courage of the Vietnamese people and planned the war on the principle of one battle and it's over. However, Vietnam had rugged terrain, dense forests, and mountains, and this only helped the Vietnamese. Vo Nguyen Giap knew this terrain and could lead his troops in an attack and disappear into the night. Ho Chi Minh, on the other hand, knew they needed more people and needed to win the minds of the people. Students scattered in all directions, screaming at the top of their voices. The event happened in broad daylight, and several witnesses were shocked that the United States government had killed its own citizens. In this ruthless shooting, news of the shooting spread like wildfire across the country. In the following days, protests intensified across the country. University students walked out of their classes in solidarity with the students. At Kent State University, a nationwide student strike took place. The rift between the government and the people only deepened. President Nixon had to address the people. However, in his address, he expressed regret about the shootings, yet he never took full responsibility for them. He also continued to explain that his decision to expand the war into Cambodia and Laos was right and crucial for winning the war. With rising tensions, this only further angered people and intensified anti-war protests. But this was only the beginning of bad things to come. The following year, in 1971, a series of classified documents known as the Pentagon Papers became public. You see, for a long time, U.S. presidents had told the people that the Vietnam War was a war for freedom. They said they were fighting to stop communism. However, when these documents emerged, they showed that wasn't the whole truth, as if the bombings of Cambodia and Laos weren't betrayal enough. The American people witnessed and had to deal with another one. All this happened because of one man. His name, Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg was a defense strategist and former military analyst. He worked at the Rand Corporation and had access to top-secret files. These files contain the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, starting from 1940. When Daniel Ellsberg read these documents, he was shocked and decided he was going to reveal the truth. It was a very dangerous thing to do, but he believed U.S. citizens deserved to know the truth about what the U.S. government was doing. The Pentagon Papers was a 7,000-page document. It was titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense on Vietnam. It was a detailed and comprehensive study that showed how successive presidents and administrations had lied to U.S. citizens about the war. This document showed how the U.S. government had long secretly expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia, without informing either the U.S. Congress or the American public. It also showed that the military had long known it was impossible to win this war, even before Richard Nixon proposed withdrawing troops. Daniel Ellsberg was horrified by this information and risked copying these top-secret files and giving them to the press, starting with the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times began publishing a series of articles detailing all the horrifying revelations. Everyone was shocked by the headlines and could hardly believe the government had been lying to them all this time. When Richard Nixon learned of this, he panicked. The document focused on exposing the decisions of former presidents, but he worried that the Pentagon Papers would only destroy what little trust people had left in the government. Anti-war protests were going on across the country, and he feared that if people saw this, it would only make things worse. So he took action. The government went to court and filed an injunction to stop the New York Times from continuing to publish the articles. But that was only the beginning. Ellsberg then gave the documents to other newspapers, such as the Washington Post and St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and soon every popular newspaper across the country was printing news about the Pentagon Papers. On its front pages, the American people across the country were able to read the publications. President Nixon and his administration took the case to court in a legal battle that was essentially the government versus the press. But the government wasn't only against the press. Soon they found out that Daniel Ellsberg was the one responsible for the leak, even if the FBI wanted to arrest him at the courthouse. This morning, they probably couldn't have. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy, theft, and violation of the Espionage Act. All his charges could cost him over 100 years in prison. It was a high-profile case, and it soon reached the Supreme Court. However, on June 30, 1971, the court ruled in favor of the New York Times and the other newspapers involved. They allowed them to continue publishing the Pentagon Papers, stating that the press had the right under the First Amendment. Justice Hugo Black stated that the press must serve the governed, not the governors. 2 years later, in 1973, Daniel Ellsberg also got his victory. During the trial, it was revealed that President Nixon and members of his administration had used illegal means to obtain their evidence. They even went so far as to break into his psychiatrist's office to steal confidential files. The charges brought against him were eventually dropped, thanks to his courage. Ellsberg became a national hero, celebrated for resisting the U.S. government's attempts to keep their criminal actions secret. The documents he released caused people to lose what little trust they had left in the government. They even began to question the legitimacy of the war. They feared the war was based on lies and that it should be stopped. The media also began digging up more information on how the United States handled the Vietnamese conflicts, and as a result, anti-war protests spread. President Nixon lost both battles. It didn't matter that the documents mainly revealed what previous administrations had done. His attempt to cover them up, combined with his secret bombings of Laos and Cambodia, only left people wary of the reliability of his character. For him, it was the beginning of the end. Besides everything that was going wrong at home, Richard Nixon was quickly realizing that things were going wrong in the war as well. After years of relentless bombings of Laos and Cambodia, it became clear that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were tougher than they had imagined. Now, with growing protests, President Richard Nixon and his administration had to find a diplomatic way to end this bloody war. However, this was not the first time they had explored diplomatic means. You see, the United States had tried to conduct diplomatic negotiations since 1968, when the outrage against the war began. They held peace talks in Paris, but the debated negotiations led to nothing advantageous. If you're wondering why, the reason is quite banal. Both sides wanted different things. The United States and South Vietnamese leaders wanted South Vietnam to remain independent without North Vietnam. Essentially, they wanted everything to remain as it was. With both sides divided along the 17th parallel, North Vietnam, on the other hand, now led by Ho Chi Minh's successors, wanted all of Vietnam united under communist rule. There was no middle ground. So the war continued. By 1972, the United States had spent so much money on bombings, meanwhile also losing many people. The international community was also against their decisions. On the other hand, although the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were relentless, they were beginning to feel the burden of the bombings. Having lost a large number of soldiers, they were beginning to crack and wanted to strike a peace deal without giving up their position. The very essence of the disagreement. But the United States did not want that. You see, the man in charge of the peace talks, Henry Kissinger, was also Nixon's national security advisor. What he hopes will be the concluding phase of negotiations to end the war in Indochina. He would eventually become Secretary of State. He had a heavy burden on his shoulders. The burden was the job of getting North Vietnam to the negotiating table. It was a daunting task, for which he had to use both diplomatic and military means. By the end of 1972, another attempt had failed, and it seemed the plan to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't working. So he went further and devised another plan. The goal of this plan was to force North Vietnam to come to the table by increasing pressure. The United States would begin a full-scale air attack on North Vietnam, especially in major cities like Haiphong and Hanoi. They would also do this during the Christmas holidays, similar to what they had done during Tet. This operation was known as Operation Linebacker 2, but was eventually renamed or popularized as the Christmas bombings. With this new set of bombings, he hoped to send a message. This message was either come to the table or continue to face intense destruction. From December 18th to 29th, 1972, North Vietnam faced 12 days of intense bombing. The United States dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. They bombed the capital Hanoi and the major port, city of Haiphong. And suddenly around Christmas, we hear about Operation Arclight. As Kissinger suggested, they bombed railways, factories, power plants, and military bases. Residential areas were also bombed, causing North Vietnam to lose hundreds of people. The bombings were relentless, day and night. Waves of B-52 bombers dropped bombs on the city, just as North Vietnamese leaders had done during the Tet Offensive. Henry Kissinger and his president, Richard Nixon, hoped they would win the psychological war, that the large amount of destruction would force North Vietnam to come to the table. But despite these bombings, North Vietnam did not surrender. In fact, Party leader Le Duan stated they were not going to be intimidated by these bombings. But this false bravado was only superficial. Behind closed doors, it was different. The bombings were both catastrophically destructive and strategic, as the targets were strategic locations and infrastructure. Countless structures in Vietnam were destroyed, including their military bases.